Have you ever wondered whether the problems in the world today would exist if we had deeper connection to ourselves, others, and the environment, and acted from that place?
Welcome to the Conscious Action Podcast with your hosts Brian Berneman and Kayla Greenville, who believe that connection is the key to taking conscious action as individuals and creating a better world.
We are here to raise awareness and inspire meaningful action by sharing stories, knowledge, and conversations with thought leaders and change makers.
From sustainability to well-being and everything related to conscious living, our mission is to empower you to be the change that you want to see in the world. Welcome everyone to a new episode of the Conscious Action Podcast. I am Brian Berneman, your host, and I have the pleasure for this episode to be joined by Eleanor West. Thank you, Eleanor, first for being here with me, taking the time from Wellington to join us. And as I always do with all of our guests, I'm going to ask you to please introduce yourself to our audience.
Kia ora. Thanks for that. I'm Eleanor. I am a current employee at the New Zealand Green Building Council, which is a not-for-profit that operates a bunch of different building certification tools and advocates to the government for better action on climate change with buildings, essentially. I studied environmental science and geography, and I'm very interested in urban areas and how we're developing, especially in response to climate change.
Wonderful. And before we get into all of these very interesting topics, how did you got interested in all of these topics, and how did you grow up with these ideas in mind, or is this something that you found later in life?
I guess I was always quite into the environment as a child, as you do. I did the EnviroSchools program and all of that. I was very interested in my garden. I had several pet snails as a child. When I finished high school, I thought, I care about the environment. This is my passion, so I'm going to go and study environmental science. And I was doing ecology as well. But I discovered through studying that as much as I really liked the theory of it all, I didn't really enjoy the practical work, that especially ecology side of things, like our field trips, you'd be going out and counting trees and measuring leaves, which is fascinating, but not really my jam. So I transitioned into geography with my environmental science major, and through that I learned, I'd done a bit of geography in high school, but I didn't really understand it as a subject until I got to uni, and I was really drawn into learning about particularly the human geography side of things, about the way we interact with place and how place influences us, and a lot of that side of my studies was pretty focused on urban humans, because I think more than 50% of New Zealanders live in cities now. And I found it weird doing environmental science at the same time, which was very much, there was this kind of dichotomy I noticed, that when we think about the environment, people tend to think about, what's wild and out there and natural. I don't really believe that we really have any wild or natural spaces left in New Zealand. Everything's quite carefully managed with pest control and, docs, very involved in all of our wild spaces. And I thought it was strange that there was never really much of a focus on urban environments, because that's kind of arguably where we do the most harm. And I guess there's a lot of potential to improve our urban environments. So I found that really interesting. So I did a sustainable architecture paper while I was studying, which I also found very interesting. As an environmental scientist, I was kind of interested in what kind of level those building practitioners were starting from. I remember going into my first tutorial for that, and we had to calculate our personal carbon footprints. And someone in my tutorial group put their hand up, and they were like, "Oh, what's a carbon emission?" And I was like, "Oh no, this is where we're starting from." So when I wrapped that up, I did a summer internship with the Green Building Council. And after I finished my degree, they offered me a job. So here I am. That's how I got into this space. I think they thought I'd done more architecture than I have done. So it was quite a steep learning curve for me, but it's been wild.
Wow. Yeah, that's so interesting. And it's so interesting that, as you mentioned, and I think that this is something that is, for a lot of people, they get into, like study or work in a specific area thinking, oh, this is something that I'm interested in. And then, as you say, like with ecology, it's like, actually, that's not for me. And then like trying to change within still what is that you're interested in, but making that shift. And I do think, interestingly, I grew up in a big city in Buenos Aires in Argentina. And for most of the spaces around there, like it is, as you say, like urban areas, like buildings and concrete. And of course, there's some spaces around that have some greens. But coming here to New Zealand, I feel like this is incredible. Like the amount of natural places, parks, ocean, mountains, beach, like everything that is around here. But as you say, like how are we actually coexisting with that, and that with all of the buildings and everything that we're actually building? It's a very interesting relationship, and I think that not many people actually consider it too much. And for the last few years here in New Zealand, I've been part of what's called placemaking. That is literally like bringing a little bit of life into places, especially in urban settings. And how can we rethink our relationship with our spaces, even when it's not the natural world and it's just that, the urban spaces?
Yeah. Right. I think that's, I think a lot of people go through life without really being in their spaces with intent, without thinking about how their spaces came to be and where they're going. And I found, that othering of the environment as being, something out there that you protect, quite like jarring.
Yeah. And what is your experience now, like being in this space? What do you feel like when people are actually creating spaces, buildings in particular, like, are they even considering what the impact it is? Like, as you're saying, like some people, and this is where we're all in a different place. Like some people don't even like think of carbon emissions as something, or don't even think of, waste and resources in a way that other people do. What do you see in that space, like just from the beginning? Like, are people even considering their impact?
You mean like practitioners in the built environment, people who are designing? And so I found an interesting quote when I was prepping for this podcast from Stephanie Carlisle, who is saying, and I will quote, "For the last 8 years, I spent every day in my professional life enabling an industry that is responsible for 40% of global climate emissions. I don't work for an oil or gas company. I don't work for an airline. I'm an architect." And I think that is quite like 40% of global emissions are associated with our buildings. So we burn fossil fuels to heat buildings and cool buildings, and the building materials we use have massive high carbon costs and are really like environmentally destructive to extract. And then construction and demolition waste is like 40% of landfill waste globally. And in New Zealand, that's actually as high as 50%, but they don't have very good data on it because we don't collect data on landfills for some reason. And we're producing all these like dead zones, like ecological dead zones where, we don't have wildlife corridors and we don't have ways for that to filter through our city and connect habitat fragmentation. So I think that there's growing awareness in the industry about green buildings and how we build more sustainable built environments. Like, I think that everyone's aware that the status quo can't go on, that we need denser cities, we need more functional communities with better connection to public transport, and we need better buildings, essentially. So I think that is changing. But I mean, in the Aotearoa context, it's kind of like we're very far behind international standards. So our building code is way below the standards required in most IEA countries with comparable climates. And it hasn't been updated since 2007. So like there was a new study out from Brands the other day showing that new houses being built in New Zealand emit 5 times more carbon than our allocated budget.
Wow.
And like we don't have any requirements for levels of insulation. There's no requirement to reduce thermal bridging. We don't have any provisions for good ventilation and vapor control. There's no requirement to have heaters in the home, no control for overheating. There's nothing on water efficiency and lighting in our building code. And there's no control on emissions, which is crazy because like in the UK, they introduced that a decade ago and they've set targets for how we're going to reduce emissions. So sorry, that was a bit of a rant, but like back to your question, I do think it's changing, but I think that there is quite still an understanding of green building on quite a tokenistic level, and perhaps not necessarily in the industry, but by people who view green buildings. For one thing, having a terrible code means that most of our buildings are built to code. People treat it as a target, not a minimum. And when you spend more money creating a green building, these developers want to do it in a way often that is marketable. And for them, that means often putting solar panels on the roof or having a green wall so that people walk past and they're like, ooh, sustainable building. But that's kind of a huge misconception because actual green buildings look just like buildings. The greenness of them is energy efficiency. That's where we're shooting for, because it's the energy that we use in our buildings to heat and cool them that has the massive carbon impacts. And then there's also like the embodied carbon of the buildings that we're building. So that's the materials that go into them, like what are we using and what's the carbon content of that, which is kind of hard to market. It's quite a complicated message for people. And like solar panels are such a buzzy, trendy thing, you know, everyone wants that on their home. But it's like, what's the point in putting a solar panel on your home if you're leaking energy out the side? You know, that's the last resort, the last thing you do once you've reached really high levels of efficiency. So I think it's changing. And I think that there is more education happening with students coming through now. And I mean, the work that we're doing at the Green Building Council, we have over 500 members now. So, you know, the industry is definitely engaged, but there's kind of a knowledge gap. There's a skill gap. We don't have enough, because our building code's been so terrible for so long, we don't have enough like trained workers who are able to build to these standards. I don't know, it's shifting.
Yeah, no, I find it interesting, you know, like that, how what you're saying, you know, like we are, if in this industry, and this is, I think, for a lot of different industries, but if the people that are actually designing already don't even have this knowledge and don't even take this into account, then the builders are actually following those instructions. And of course, you know, like, if from the get-go the code is so minimum that, you know, like the materials don't need to be good, whatever we do with the waste and when demolition is not good, and then energy efficiency, like it's not good, then where are we aiming to go? It's really interesting. And when I came to New Zealand, the first place that I stayed in, I was shocked how much I was paying and how cold it was. I was like, I couldn't believe it. I'm like, this is like, you know, in general, like, this is not a hot, warm country. Like, there's like parts of the year where it's quite cold. And I was inside of the apartment and I'm like, I'm freezing here. And we weren't able to turn on the heater for such a long time because it was super expensive. And I'm like, okay, so what do I do?
Yeah, and New Zealanders kind of think that's normal. They're like, oh, this is a rite of passage. Everyone goes through life living in a really, really cold, awful, damp house that's making them sick. But it's like, in countries that we consider ourselves to be like, I suppose, ahead of, economically or whatever, like Argentina, for instance. I think a lot of New Zealanders would say like, oh, we're more developed than Argentina, but it's like, not when it comes to our housing portfolio.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
Yeah, and why, like, I mean, I understand, as you say, like, that's a little bit, because I heard from one of my housemates at the very beginning was toughen up, and I'm like, that's part of the culture here, but
Oh yeah, the put a sweater on culture.
yeah, like, why, like, why has this been like that? Is it basically like just from a cultural standpoint, or like is it basically just the code, that is what the code allows? So then basically like insulation and proper like heating and energy efficiency has been, not a part of building houses, so then that is what we are.
I think it's kind of all of those things, and it is like, it's been this way for so long. I think a lot of people haven't experienced the housing quality overseas and they think, oh, that's an added expense, like that's an unattainable level, which it's really not. But I think that New Zealand also, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a weird like a preference people have for architectural value. They're like, I want an architecturally designed home, or this is a beautiful heritage home. And that kind of thing is prioritized. Like, everyone wants their home to be bespoke. No one wants to live in a suburb where all the houses look the same. In New Zealand, that's like the worst thing ever, apparently. And there's this conception that architecturally designed homes, bespoke homes, that's what makes us cool and different. But I've spent a lot of time in the Netherlands, and you walk down the streets there with their beautiful terrace housing, and every house looks the same, but it's kind of like, it's nice. They're warm and efficient, and like, it's kind of beautiful, and yeah,
and I'd rather be comfortable in my home than for my home to look nice.
Right, it's weird to prioritize aesthetic value over comfort, but I think a lot of people do that.
Yeah, and why do you think that the code hasn't changed, or the code, in a sense, allows for such a low quality?
Yeah, it beats me. I don't know. I do know that like it is a recognized issue, and the government is working on it. So they've recently had a consultation out on the Building for Climate Change program. I don't know if you saw anything about that. They released it on a Friday, which is a surefire way to not get anyone to respond. But it's really ambitious. Like, they're talking about how are we going to get to net zero carbon buildings by 2050. That's like a roadmap of sorts. They're prioritizing all of these targets that we're going to meet, and we're going to shift the industry. So I think submissions closed on that a couple of weeks ago. But that is a really exciting piece of work. My like biggest concern with all the changing of the election cycles and everything, that gets kind of deprioritized over the next year, and I really hope that it doesn't. It's really important that this piece of work is seen as a huge deal and remains really ambitious and doesn't get watered down. Like, I don't want to see any slipping of targets or timelines, because New Zealand needs to halve its emissions by 2030, and not every sector is in a position to be able to do that, which means the building industry needs to be doing the heavy lifting. Like, we can do more than halve our emissions by 2030. It's kind of like low-hanging fruit in some ways, because the technology exists. Like, we've seen overseas that it is possible to build near zero carbon buildings. Like, we know how to do that. We have all the tech. We just need to train the industry in New Zealand. And it's kind of also low-hanging fruit in that it's not like agriculture. It would be weird to complain about having a nicer house or a nicer building, like there's, it benefits people's lives, and it makes them healthier, and it's better for our economy, because people in warmer buildings take less sick days, and that saves us money on the healthcare system as well, because our homes and buildings are making us sick at the moment. Like, New Zealand is it is the only OECD country, I think, where we still get cases of rheumatic fever like rheumatic fever is seen as a third world disease, but in New Zealand it's quite prevalent and hugely concerning. So I think it's a recognized problem. And I think that there's been a lot of attention on housing in particular in the last 3 years. People calling into question, like, why are we living this way? Renters' rights, we've seen the recent government pass the healthy home standards about improving housing quality for tenants, which is exciting progress, but it's not really happening fast enough. And yeah, it still horrifies me to compare our building code to what they have overseas. And it's like, yeah, I guess it's having that public attention on it and people actually understanding what the issues are and how we solve those. Like, the problem is the building code. That needs to change.
Yes, definitely. And it's so interesting, as you mentioned, like how this is not just, in a sense, this is the building and construction. This is actually our carbon footprint within the country. This is people's health, because as you mentioned, like having a lack of insulation or leaky homes or whatever it is that people are going through, which is quite prevalent here, then that makes our well-being be an issue, which then means, okay, we need more money for that, and people then cannot work. And people, like, especially with a lot of people that live in homes that are not in good quality, and big like families that live in those places, like this starts becoming this snowball, and it's such a big issue. So my question is, what, like, with the Green Building Council and the rest of the work that it's been done, what are the steps that we can take, as individuals? Like, besides changing the code, that's hopefully something that happens. What can we still do in our lives to actually improve our situation?
Yeah, I mean, lobbying the government is like my number one very effective use of your time. But in terms of like people's personal homes, at the end of 2018, we released a new building rating scheme called HomeFit, which is all about like how you can make achievable improvements to existing residential homes. So if you were to what's the URL? Homefit.org.nz. There's like an online check you can do to assess the health of your home, essentially, to check for the different things that we recommend. And then it gives you like all this advice on how you can fix the issues that have been identified. And once your home is looking good, is a term we use, you can have a official home fit assessment done where someone will come to your house and assess it, and then you get like a stamp like, yes, home fit certified. And our goal is that will help consumers of like, people buying houses or looking to rent will be able to look for this stamp and be like, oh, I want this one because it's going to be easier to keep it warm and dry. And like the kinds of things that you can do in your own home, ceiling and underfloor insulation are like biggies. That's a really effective way to reduce the energy consumption of your home and keep it warmer and reduce your power bills. I think there's been a real like understanding, like an awakening amongst New Zealanders about insulation. That needs to come with an awakening about ventilation, because a really well insulated home that's not well ventilated is like living inside a plastic bag, and that's when you get mold. So yeah, opening windows is good, but really important to have a kitchen extract to extract all that extra moisture out of your home, and bathroom extracts as well. So those are both required under the healthy home standards now, but if you're living in like in an owner occupied house, can highly recommend doing that. I know a lot of my student friends don't use their extracts because they perceive that it's an extra power bill cost, but like that cost is minimal, and getting that moisture out of your home is so important. Moist air is really hard to heat. And then like the other thing that's really worth doing is ground sheets, like ground vapor barriers. So you roll that out under your home. It's like a plastic layer, and it stops moisture evaporating into the house. And I remember having this conversation with my landlord about the upcoming healthy home standards and being like, oh, we don't have a ground vapor barrier under our house. Like, that needs to happen. And she was like, oh, I really don't understand that, because that'll just trap pooling water under the house. And I was like, well, if there's pooling water under the house, we've got bigger things to deal with. Like, there shouldn't be water pooling under your house. So making sure that the drainage around the home is adequate and stopping that from happening, and then get a ground vapor barrier. Because it's really alarming. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I remember reading the statistics on how much water evaporates from the ground into your home, even if it looks and feels dry to the touch. And then curtains. I don't think people really... That's another thing about New Zealand homes. People have this perception that it's really important to have huge windows to let in lots of sun. Windows have terrible insulation value. They're really, really bad compared to walls. Like, yes, they'll let in lots of sun during the day, but they'll let out all that heat as soon as the sun's gone. Having big windows is not actually a good thing. You shouldn't need heaps of sun in your house to keep it warm. And if you do have big windows, or your windows aren't double glazed, and even if they are double glazed, actually, curtains are like the hero of a home. It really drives me crazy driving around Wellington at night, seeing people with their lights on and don't have their curtains closed. And I'm like, all your heat's escaping out of your home. And curtains, you want to have them double layered so that they trap that heat really effectively, and are closed on 3 sides, so that like it's touching the wall on each edge, and it's either touching the ground or it's on closed tracks at the top so that the heat can't escape. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't sound like, like sexy building things. It's probably cooler to be able to tell your friends that you have a solar panel or a grey water recycling system, but like those things are the bare minimum. People should be doing that, and it has like energy efficiency gains and improves your home quality and make you healthier. Yeah,
and makes potentially your bills even cheaper.
Yeah, people should close their curtains at night.
Yeah, nice. And like I'm really interested, like on, because I've seen through the last few years a lot of advancements on materials, and like I'm seeing hemp, I'm seeing mycelium, and I'm seeing 3D printing and all of this. What from all of these new technologies, or like relatively new technologies, what of this actually could we start seeing more of, and is it actually better?
Yeah, I mean, those things you mentioned, like hemp and mycelium, anything that traps carbon in a home is good. Like if it's trapping carbon, like if you're growing something, essentially, if it's an organic compound, and it's trapping carbon and going into a home that doesn't get demolished, that's carbon from the atmosphere trapped, so that's good. In terms of those newer materials, I'm not too up to date on where we're at with hemp in New Zealand. It's still quite a new thing. But the material that we would love to see more of is cross-laminated timber. So that's like where you get sheets of timber and you glue them together at different angles to make it way stronger. And we've seen cases overseas of people building apartment blocks and skyscrapers out of cross-laminated timber. That's not really happening in New Zealand. It's perceived as quite a risky building material just because we haven't had very many projects use it here. So it's not really that risky, but New Zealand is quite a risk-averse construction industry. So we need to see more projects piloting that, because the thing about timber is that it has really, really low embodied carbon, or even in some people see it as a negative because it's trapping the carbon from the atmosphere. But I guess it kind of depends what happens to it at the end of the building's life, whether or not it's carbon negative. But compared to products like concrete and steel, which are really high in embodied carbon. And I think it's kind of funny seeing all of these office sustainability programs where, the companies are really proudly saying like, oh, we saved a ton of paper in our office this last year. And it's like, cool story. But like, if you design that building with 1 ton less concrete, you wouldn't have need to have gone through all the effort to save all of this paper, because that would have had a way bigger impact, you know? So yes, it's choosing the right materials with low embodied carbon, but it's also dematerializing. I really like the KISS principle when it comes to buildings. You know, keep it simple, stupid. Don't make it overly complicated. Reduce the amount of materials need. Nice, simple shapes. And then there are some instances where you just don't need things. Like ceiling tiles are a really good example of that. There's a trend at the moment in building design towards having like exposed surfaces where you look up at the ceiling and you can see all the pipes and electricity wires and stuff, which I think is quite cool, because it reminds people that buildings are like a functioning piece of engineering. They're not just an object. But also, like, you save all the embodied carbon of the ceiling tiles, because other than like acoustic purposes, in which case some cases it's appropriate to have them, but other than that they don't really serve a purpose. Or like paint, it's cool to leave things unfinished, you know. Like, you don't need to paint your concrete, or don't paint the wood, you know. It's
and I think that, you know, that as you mentioned, it's really interesting how for the last few years, like, companies that do feel like, you know, like, we want to do things, there's this lack of awareness in a sense, and we are like doing the small little things that we know that we can do, like, we recycle this, or we reduce this, and we are still doing this big thing. It's like,
there's a lack of awareness of what the big impacts are.
I often talk about this in terms of, you know, like, big corporations doing that have a huge impact in the world, like negative impact in terms of footprint, that then they create a social responsible, you know, like, program, and they are helping a community or something like that. And I'm like, that's awesome for these companies that are actually doing something good, but they are doing this whilst they are doing that other huge thing. So I would much rather them not actually doing that. And
it's kind of greenwashing.
Yes, but it is the interesting thing, because I do feel like there is some that are doing it as greenwashing, and some that are literally doing it because that's what they think that they can do. Like, if I don't realize, you know, like, the footprint of the building is going to be huge, I'm just going to focus on, we're going to sort out our rubbish, and we're going to recycle well, and we're going to compost.
But I mean, like, in terms of like commercial office spaces or whatever, it's becoming way less, there's less of a barrier to actually learning and understanding, like, the energy efficiency of your office, for instance. We've brought a rating tool from Australia into New Zealand called Neighbours, which assesses the energy efficiency of your building, and you get it assessed every year, and then you like fine tune the way it's working to reduce the energy consumption over time. And in Australia, they've mandated doing these energy efficiency ratings for office spaces over a certain size, and it's really like changed the market, because everyone has to display this information like an Energy Star rating on your dishwasher, but for a building. It means that when people are looking for new tenancies, they can be like, oh, well, this building's got a 5-star neighbours rating, so I'm going to move into that one because it's going to save me energy. And we have this ratings scheme in New Zealand now, and it's, you know, it's having greater and greater uptake. It's not mandated yet, but you know, it's becoming easier to find out that information, and it's accessible. And I really don't think that there are excuses at this point.
And I do think, you know, as well, with some of this, especially for those that can think a little bit longer term and not just super short term, that, you know, like a family that can't really afford to buy the most efficient appliances because they literally don't have the money. If a big company can actually think like long term and think, you know, like, we can actually spend this money because in the long term, or in a few years, the energy efficiency and all of the things that we are doing that's just going to, from a financial standpoint even, that's just going to be better.
Yeah.
And bonus, we are actually doing something that is not as bad for the environment.
Yeah, like there are environmental benefits, and the high capital costs, they definitely pay off over the lifetime of the building through lower operational costs. But then there's also, because it's like you're saying, like people on low incomes can't necessarily afford to make these upgrades to their houses. But if the people who can afford to do it, you have an equity benefit as well, because it means like if your massive development company is specifying triple glazed windows, you're buying a lot of them, and it means that the retailers in New Zealand can reduce the price of these windows because there's a market for them, which has flow-on effects for people on lower incomes.
Yeah, and I'm super interested, like hopefully, as you were saying before, if the code changes and like what's mandated, like it's a higher quality, and like that of course will have the same impact. Things will become like higher quality, materials will become a little bit cheaper, and then we can actually see that everywhere. And
oh yeah,
and I'm curious, like what's the impact? I don't know if this is something that you know too much or not, but in terms of you talked about energy, water, like our use of water, like especially now, for example, in Auckland, that we're having a shortage of water. How in the building industry, how is that seen? Is there something that is being done to actually make homes, in a sense, more efficient with the water usage?
Yeah, so it's again like the energy. The focus needs to be on efficiency first. So using low flow like showers and putting flow restrictors on taps and that kind of thing, and reducing the water consumption in the building is really important. That's where we need to start. Also, just using less water. Like we live pretty affluent lifestyles in New Zealand. Maybe you don't need to shower every day. It's actually not very good for your skin. And from that aspect, like reducing water use is pretty straightforward. And in landscaping as well, making sure that you're planting plants that like native plants are usually quite well adapted to the climate and don't necessarily need as much watering. If you are irrigating, you should be using drip irrigators, not sprinklers, because they are terrible. Lawns are the kiss of death for biodiversity, so maybe think about not having a lawn. That kind of stuff to reduce water. And then there's the whole like, in Auckland, you're having a drought at the moment. There's a lot of debate going on about rainwater tanks, people having those at home. But Watercare has actually done research into this. And in terms of water efficiency, but also carbon efficiency, it's actually better to invest in big scale, like hydro dams sort things to hold water, rather than individual rain tanks for every house, because we've already got the water infrastructure for one thing. And then there's the embodied carbon cost of a rain tank. And there's also the issue that if you are relying on your rainwater tank for water, that's great, but then you get further into the drought, you run out of water and you're back on the mains, and then there's this surge of more people needing water, which is kind of not ideal. And it's kind of better in a way that if you're going to spend $5,000 on a rainwater tank, maybe just donate that money to your local council, because they could really use the funds to invest in water infrastructure.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm fascinated about all of this because, of course, like it's not my area of expertise, but I'm seeing all of these different like things coming together and learning more. And the other thing that I wanted to talk about was you were saying at the beginning, like demolition and all of this. How can we get or is this something that is actually being explored, and are there like more information about seeing everything as a resource and not as waste? Like, because waste shouldn't exist. Like, we shouldn't take things to the landfill. Everything should somehow get reused or repurposed. And I see a lot of times, like construction sites, and the bins, and I'm like, everything is there. I don't know what's happening. Is it all going to landfill?
Yeah, you mean like moving towards that circular economy in the building industry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts on that. I guess first up, we need to be moving towards more prefab construction in New Zealand. That has big waste reduction implications. Like if you're building houses in a factory, you can use the materials more efficiently than if it's being constructed bespoke on site. So that's one thing. And then also the way that we build things in New Zealand, we're really into bonding materials together, like gluing stuff. Spray foam insulation drives me crazy because that like contaminates all the materials it touches, and then none of that can be recycled. So it's at the design end, like at the beginning of life of the building, it's about how can you design out waste, like I was talking before about dematerialization, but also designing for deconstruction, like having a plan for at the end of life of this building, how is it going to be taken apart and what's going to happen to these materials, using more recycled materials in your building, like specifying these things as a designer, and creating a market for them, because at the moment it's not very profitable to recycle building materials in New Zealand because one of the reasons is because there's not much of a market for them. The other reason is that we don't have any levies on construction and demolition landfills, so it's very cheap to just dump that, which is changing. The government is going to be introducing levies onto C&D landfills, but they're very, very low, not really enough to incentivize recycling. And then there's also the issue, like in Auckland, they do have a C&D, like construction and demolition recycling facility called Green Gorilla, and that's like a profitable business model. It's working well, but they're able to do that because they have the quantity of waste needed to make that profitable. In places like Wellington or in anywhere out of Auckland, to be fair, we can't. You'd be crazy as a business owner to set up a C&D recycling facility because the volumes of waste are not high enough to make that profitable. And the waste minimisation fund from government are available for capital expenditure, like the costs to build this facility, but not to operate it, which is stupid. So advocate to government to change that, team. And then there's also the issue that our code, once again, makes it difficult to use recycled materials in buildings because of the fact that you have to specify everything so early on, like when you go in for building consent. So someone gave me the example the other day, like if you're building a house and you're going to have a handrail on the stairs, you can't just put in your building consent handrail on stairs. You have to say which brand, like what handrail you're going to use. So you can't say like, oh, I'm going to go to my C&D facility and pick one up on the day. You've got to know in advance, which means you've got to hoard all these materials while you're designing the building before you even start it, which is a massive expenditure. And then, when the materials do get recycled, they're often being downcycled, like concrete, for instance. When that gets recycled, it's being essentially crushed up and used as aggregate in roads. And same for glass, that gets used a lot as an aggregate rather than being recycled back into glass. So it's really about like making sure you get the design right, designing for deconstruction and using more recycled materials.
Yes, definitely. And we already explored a lot of things, and I want to get to a last few questions. The first of this is, and perhaps it's something already that you have mentioned, but what is one resource that you would recommend to people?
I really like. There's a blog in the States called Tree Hugger. I don't read most of Tree Hugger, but I really enjoy their sustainable design editor. I think his name's Lloyd Alter. His articles are really digestible, like for a non-building professional. You could go in there, read that stuff, and really get a good understanding of the nuances of sustainable construction and what a green design really means. Also, I am very excited to be on a podcast because I love listening to podcasts. Is it okay if I give more than one resource?
Yes, of course.
Podcasts. I really enjoy Jade Kake's Indigenous Urbanism. We didn't really touch on this, but like I am a firm believer in being a good treaty partner, respecting Indigenous sovereignty, and Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So I really enjoy Indigenous urbanism. I can highly recommend that. I also really enjoy the podcast 99% Invisible, which is all about like design and everyday life, things that you don't really think about, which has really made me more conscious of the places I'm inhabiting. But they have a few really good episodes on buildings, like things, and there's a really good one on sand and how we're running out of sand. Yeah, those are some resources that I enjoy.
Yeah, that's excellent. And just as you were mentioning it, just to explore it a little bit more, what from like the indigenous standpoint you feel like it's important to introduce into this space?
I think that housing quality in New Zealand is a huge equity issue, and it's affecting a lot of Māori and Pacific Islanders in particular, the low quality of housing, but there is also just some straight up racism in the way that the system works. I'm a big fan of Jade Kake. She also has a really fantastic book called Rebuilding the Kāinga, all about how we can encourage the development of like kāinga villages on iwi-owned land, and at the moment it's very difficult to do that in New Zealand because it's really hard to get a loan for land that is like co-owned if you're not the sole owner of that land, and then there are loans available from I think it's from Te Puni Kokiri, but they require you to build your home off the ground so that if you default on the loan, they can take the home away, is essentially the gist of that, which is not good because it's not the most efficient way to build houses. Concrete slabs are usually, depending on the circumstances, they're usually a better building material. Also, it's just racist. Like no other loan system in New Zealand requires you to build your home off the ground so they can take it away if you default. Yes, I do think that there are a lot of equity issues. I think climate justice has a big role in the building and housing industry. Yeah, which I could do a whole podcast exploring that.
Yeah, no, and it's super interesting. And like, I've been like through the years here in New Zealand, like talking with a lot of indigenous people, and with some of the episodes, actually, some that I already recorded as well, that will come up soon as well. Like just exploring from different perspectives, actually, the importance of coming back to some of these viewpoints and some of this philosophy, and understanding actually how beneficial they are for all of the challenges that we're going through, and especially with climate change and climate justice, like the space to come back to those that had the knowledge and were more attuned to our interrelationship with the land. I think that it's super important.
I completely agree.
Yeah, awesome. And what is the one go-to tip that you can give to people?
Close your curtains at night and don't put skylights in your home. They're like energy leaks out your ceiling. The thermal efficiency of a skylight is fractional compared to a roof. There are better ways to get light into your home.
Nice. Wonderful. And on a personal level, what has been your latest small act of kindness?
This morning I made the conscious decision to buy my lunch because we only had a little bit of bread left, and I know how much my partner enjoys his sandwiches, and I was like, I'm going to leave him to eat that bread.
Ah, nice. That's a good one. Oh, I'm sure that he was happy to find that there. Nice. And what is the one thing that you wish the world knew?
I wish people conceived green buildings as energy efficiency first. I wish people thought that that was cool and sexy, and that people understood that green walls, solar panels, that kind of stuff is a nice to have, not a need to have.
Wonderful. That's amazing. Yeah. And lastly, how can people find more about what you do and what the New Zealand Green Building Council is doing?
Yeah, the NZGBC website is a great resource, but I guess we kind of generally have more of a focus on industry, but HomeFit, I think, is a really cool resource. So if you just head to homefit.org.nz, you can self-assess your home and find out all this information, because there's a real information deficit in New Zealand about good quality homes, and it's in a really digestible and easy to understand format. And I think, it can make a big difference to people's lives to just have that information at their fingertips and be able to make those changes.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much, Eleanor, for taking the time to be here and for sharing all of this. I'm sure that for a lot of people, including myself, like there's so much to unpack from the conversation and so much information there and things that we can actually do. So thank you for taking the time to be here and sharing, and for all of the work that you're doing. And I hope that you keep on making the changes in the industry. As you're saying, it's a big like part of our footprint, so hopefully we get a lot of those changes. And once again, thank you so much, and thank you to everyone that has been listening to this episode. I would love to know what you've learned. I would love for you to share the stories as well, if you have stories of like bad insulation and cold or whatever it's been with your housing situation. I would love to hear that. And yes, until the next episode.
Kia ora. And I think that's, we've got a big road ahead of us, not just with the industry, but with educating the public. So thank you for having me on your program today. And I do hope people have learned stuff. And if you do have questions, feel free to reach out to the Green Building Council. We love engaging.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you, everyone. Until next time. Bye.
Ka kite.
What did you like the most about this episode? Take a moment to think about what change you can make in your life today.
Share your conscious action on social media using #ConsciousAction and tagging @ConsciousActionNZ so we can celebrate your impact on the world and create a ripple effect.
One easy action we would love for you to take right now is to share, like, and subscribe to this podcast. This will help us get these messages out into the world and inspire more people to take conscious action in their own lives, contributing to the better world we hope for.